aspect. So this is the Performance-Based Regulation Foundation's webinar with the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. I'm Carrie Worthington with the Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and this webinar is for the Performance-Based Regulation State Working Group. The working group is facilitated by NARUC. This is me, Carrie Worthington, and that's my contact information. We thank the U.S. Department of Energy for their ongoing support. Now I would like to introduce Andrea Frazier from the District of Columbia Public Service Commission. Andrea has over 15 years of experience, has an engineering background, and is really excellent at really diving in on this issue. So we thank her for her time with us today and her experience that she contributes to the industry at large. So Andrea, thank you, and take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Carrie. I assume that everyone can hear me?
Yep.
Great. So again, thanks, Carrie, and thanks, Carrie, to you and your team for setting this webinar up. It's mostly appreciated. I am Andrea Frazier. I'm a policy advisor with the DC Commission. Our webinar today is, as Carrie mentioned, is going to be on the foundations of performance-based regulation. Today, we have two panelists with us, and to be mindful of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Our first panelist today is Michael O'Boyle of Energy Innovation. Mike, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll turn it over to you so we can get started. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. I see. Okay, there's my there's my face. All right, great. Hi everyone. I'm providing an overview of performance-based regulation for the webinar today. In case you guys are not familiar, Energy Innovation is a policy think tank and research group located in San Francisco, California. We focus on work directly with policymakers to help transform the energy system to a low carbon energy system. And in the context of power sector, I've been working for the last 5.5 years on a program that recently got rolled into EI's main group called America's Power Plan. And the goal really is to assist policymakers with policy design to transform the electricity system to a clean, affordable, reliable system. So we have done work on performance-based regulation, which is not just a policy that can help with decarbonization, but more broadly, just system optimization, cost reduction, reliability, and resilience, and is really an emerging best practice in power sector regulation and transformation. And please feel free to reach out after this webinar if you want to discuss further. So next slide. So I'm just going to go through the sort of why performance-based regulation is an emerging topic these days, how it works sort of in theory, and then some examples that then Matt will build upon of performance incentive mechanisms or performance-based rate-making mechanisms. Next slide. So first, it's our thesis that the power sector has evolved from some old goals and old options for system optimization to a series of new goals that build upon those old goals, some of which are still really important, most of them, but there are new options. So next slide. From meeting growing demand and building new infrastructure, particularly to meet universal service, we now see that the goal of power sector investment has been toward maintaining and modernizing infrastructure. Resilience is increasingly important with especially increasingly severe weather events. Clean power is something customers are demanding and is also the cheapest new option, new build in most of the country. Customer satisfaction and choice have always been important, but choice is becoming more possible with distributed energy resources, and of course affordability and safety are still paramount. There are also new options to consider for optimizing the system around these goals. All the old stuff, of course, the centralized large-scale investments where economies of scale still make sense, but also increasing opportunities for competition at the grid edge with distributed energy resources providing grid services and reducing costs for customers, reducing carbon, et cetera, efficiency, demand response, distributed PV, electric vehicles, et cetera. And also big data, advanced IT, and these make it possible for more widespread deployment of advanced rate designs that might better serve the goals of the power system. So next slide. So this creates two new issues. The first is increasing options for power system optimization actually lead to greater information asymmetry between the utility and regulator. Whereas you could sort of count on economies of scale as you're expanding the power system to meet more and more customer demand, now with customer side resources being cost-effective options and also being better options to serve customers the way that they want, there's a lot more choices the utility can make in how it plans an invested system. The regulator does not have access to all that information, and so the asymmetry rises. There are also those new goals for the power system, which mean regulators have to re-examine the existing incentives to build more capital and maintain existing investments, which I'll talk about in a bit. So next slide. So regulation can evolve along with the new goals and new options for optimizing the system. Again, the old methods or existing methods of line-by-line investment review, capital investment and sales growth, driving shareholder value, infrequent rate cases, and operational expenses as a pass-through, many of those will continue to exist, but there are new methods that can help deal with the rising information asymmetry. Focusing on outcomes and targets for those outcomes to sort through complexity and focus on new value creating activities for the utility, creating incentives to optimize the system using customer side resources, third-party providers as alternatives to utility investment, multi-year rate plans, which Matt will expound on, and also meeting customer demands for clean energy, lower bills, enhanced reliability and resilience, and self-generation. Next slide. So performance-based regulation really changes the central question of regulation from did we pay the right amount for what we got, a sort of backward-looking assessment of what was the cost of service, to a forward-looking one, are we paying the right amount for what we want? And this perspective is described in one of the foundational materials for America's Power Plan that's cited on the right by former Colorado regulator Ron Lair, who still works a lot with energy innovation. Next slide. So how does this work? What is the sort of mechanics behind PBR? Next slide. Can you advance the slide? I think there are steps here, which I should have taken out. All right, back one. Thank you. So here's a simplified rendering that many of you, I'm sure, have seen of cost of service regulation. The basic relationship here is that as utility investment increases, revenue and value, and by value, I mean value for the utility shareholders, increases. Next slide. Sorry, is it advanced for you guys?
Yeah, Mike, it's showing elements of cost of service equation.
Okay, great. So you can sort of further simplify the equation by in that circle is supposed to be ROR, but I think there's a formatting blip. But anyway, so essentially there are pass-throughs which don't really drive shareholder value creation, and then the CapEx times rate of return is really the greatest opportunity for affecting shareholder value overall in the cost of service model. And so the result is these embedded incentives to maximize capital investment. And so that's what you see utilities trying to do. Next slide. So here comes some finance from economist Alfred Kahn, some concepts that are really helpful, I think, for putting performance-based regulation sort of in the context of, regulatory best practice. So let's go to the next slide. So here's an equation. Could you advance it all the way? Sorry. For figuring out the stock price called the dividend discount model. Essentially, the circle. It's funny, the things are getting moved around a little bit, but that's okay. So the circle is, imagine it's around the R minus K variable on the right. R is the rate of return that regulated entities are getting, and K is the cost of capital. And so essentially, what drives the increase in shareholder value is that gap between R and K. As long as that is positive, you get a sort of multiplier on the asset value of the company every time they make a new capital investment, and that increases the value of the stock. So it's all about the difference between ROR and the underlying cost of capital. And right now, and for quite a long time in the last couple of decades, R has been greater than K, and therefore you've seen growing utility appetite for capital investment as a growth strategy. Next slide. All right, so sorry, thank you. This creates the incentive to invest capital in the system and maximize the earned rate of return. This is actually not an inherent issue if what you want is capital investment and what you observe is economies of scale. And if you remember those old goals of universal service and capital expansion, the incentive to invest in capital is actually quite a positive one. We need capital investment to maintain reliability and to incent utilities to find value in serving new customers. And so it's really well suited to the old business model, which included expansion of access. So this rate of return, it fulfills an institutional function. It has to provide the incentive to private management that competition and profit maximization are supposed to provide in the non-regulated private economy. And when you have a sort of ex ante rate of return that is not dependent on performance, it's just there is a prudence evaluation, right? But not more nuanced, then it's not quite meeting that function. And I would argue performance-based rate making is a way of distinguishing between companies that have superior performance and would do better in a competitive market and those that would not. Next slide. So there have to be some means of seeing to it that those supernormal returns are earned. It's not that we want to make the cost of capital exactly equal to the earned rate of return. Then you don't really have the incentive for the utility to pursue value. But performance-based rate making is a way of distinguishing between value creating activities and aligning the public interest with utility value or utility profit maximization. Next slide. So here's one way you can think about achieving that using the rate of return as the sort of, we call it the utility value engine in a paper we wrote a few years ago. So seeing the cost of service regulation equation as it was before, but adding plus or minus performance so that as revenue increases, as performance improves on the right, revenue for the utility increases on the left. This maintains the cost of service equation, but perhaps moves the base ROR closer to the cost of capital, and then those value creating activities are what drive that delta and ultimately improved shareholder value. Next slide. So version 2 of this incentive-based regulation is to put what used to be pass-throughs and the capital expenses sort of closer together in a revenue cap or multi-year rate plan alongside performance incentive mechanisms. So Matt is going to talk a lot more about what that looks like, I believe, but I will just note that sort of the more things that you make forward-looking and use benchmarks and baselines to calibrate, you do create new risks as a regulator that your counterfactuals that you work out with the utility may mean either more forecast error or windfalls for the utility. So the devil is really in the details of how to do this stuff well, but you can sort of see how by tweaking the regulatory model, you can align the outcomes that you're trying to drive with utility profit maximization. Next slide. So here's kind of another way of looking at how the revenue model changes from a traditional model to a performance value model, where value is derived both from investments and also from performance. The red box represents new incentives available for value creating activities. And I'll provide some examples of what those might look like in the next slides. One more, please. Thank you. So some examples of common PBR mechanisms already in use. And I think it's just worth observing that performance-based regulation and incentives, utility regulation in the utility industry, it's already a standards-driven industry, whether you're talking about reliability standards or evaluating things for prudency, or there are a lot of more common PBR mechanisms like efficiency performance incentives, RPSs. These are all performance incentives in their own right. And so here are some to observe that are pretty common. Next. So some additional ideas in the affordability category, revenue caps or revenue per customer, shared savings mechanisms, utility, or I should say customer participation in time of use rates as a metric for utility performance, or load factor improvements. These are all either system efficiency or cost saving metrics or incentives that can drive a more affordable system. If you're looking at clean as an outcome, in addition to RPSs and efficiency incentives, measuring carbon emissions or setting a target, seeing how many customers are able to access clean energy, whether it's through a green tariff or customer side generation. And then in the reliability category, looking at resilience as a new emerging field and trying to figure out what metrics and targets make sense there, so that you know that you're getting what utilities promise. Next slide. So this is I really tore through it here. Where to start? I think it's worth considering Minnesota's iterative approach, the sort of wheel of self-improvement here for performance incentive mechanism development. Minnesota is firmly in number 4 and moving toward 5 and 6. So the commission articulated some goals for system optimization, identified desired outcomes, went through a massive stakeholder process massive in terms of getting input from many different stakeholders, identifying performance metrics and winnowing them down to what was most necessary, and then establishing some metrics, reviewing those and requiring the utility to report them. I think that's a solid baseline or solid foundation to build upon as you consider, whether to go further. It's kind of a no regrets measure in my view, to establish metrics and review them around outcomes that perhaps the utility is not achieving, but perhaps you lack sufficient information to know that the utility actually won't do it or can't do it without some sort of incentive. So starting that process of creating a set of metrics for utility performance and perhaps discussions about what targets make sense, and then moving on to step 6 and 7 here to establishing some incentives as needed and evaluating, improving them and repeating them. I think it's also important just to note that PBR is a process that I don't think is ever quite finished. Once you set a performance-based system in place, you have to iterate and be willing to try new things and improve it. So that's my whole presentation for now, but I would love to continue the conversation with any of you at a later date. And here's my contact info. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike.
Sure thing.
We're going to, you're welcome. So again, we're going to hold all questions until the end. Should you have any questions, please remember to chat or put those into the chat box so that we can ask those at the end. And now I will turn it over to Matt McDonald from Stratogen. Hi, Matt.
Hi, thank you. Hope everyone can hear me all right. Just by way of quick introduction, Matt McDonald, Director at Stratogen. And in my role with Stratogen, I support primarily utility commissions and consumer advocates across a number of regulatory domains, from distributed energy resources to power system planning, as well as the instant topic here, performance-based regulation. Some of what helps inform, my views on this topic comes from the time that I spent with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission as Commission Counsel and staff there. And very happy to see some of my colleagues on the call today, and some of the concepts that I'll be discussing may look familiar to them. So to move forward, Mike did a very nice job of sort of setting the table for my portion of this discussion. Both as informed by my experience in working through PBR issues at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, as well as further research and surveys and investigations of other best practices across the U.S. and North America. I wanted to start by presenting some key takeaways on this subject at a high level. And then I think Mike did a nice job of pointing this out in terms of the nature, the sort of the drivers as to why performance-based regulation is an emerging best practice, as Mike put it, sort of the evidence of a changing electric industry that's motivating desire for regulatory framework evolution as well. Then I'll move to provide a summary of alternative regulation mechanisms. So the specific mechanics and different mechanisms that can be pulled together in a holistic and comprehensive way to comprise an overarching PBR framework. And that's where we move to number 4, sort of pulling all the pieces together and seeing how a balanced portfolio of mechanisms can really drive enhanced performance and customer value. Next slide, please. Focusing on key takeaways. So just as an overview, I think there's clearly a structural shift in the way that the traditional utility business model has functioned in the past. And there is a range of different changing dynamics at play that have resulted in a number of different alternative regulatory mechanisms having been built up over time. And a growing number of states, as evidenced in part by the interest in this discussion today, are considering or actively pursuing changes to their existing regulatory frameworks. And so regulators, stakeholders, utilities alike, there's a real need to proactively engage with and help shape the evolution of the discussions, or risk having others dictate it for them, whether that's the legislature or other parties. Because fundamentally, as I'll attempt to demonstrate here in terms of the nature of some of the drivers motivating these discussions, the very nature of the regulatory framework and process needs to change as a result of the energy transition that's underway. So some leading examples that we've highlighted through our investigations and research in the past. New York is clearly an oft-touted example. New York's regulatory framework includes multi-year rate plans and earning adjustment mechanisms, as well as performance mechanisms, or PIMs, and we'll get into that a little bit later, along with platform service revenues. Illinois is a classic example of a performance-based formula rate plan. And Hawaii, it's currently in progress, is a great example of a very comprehensive approach to PBR in the United States, which includes multi-year rate plan, development of performance mechanisms, as well as shared savings. And Vermont, I'd love to highlight because of its incorporation of this concept known as a regulatory sandbox. In Vermont, there's this pilot framework that permits utility flexibility in development of innovative pilots. And we'll talk a bit about that later on. Next slide, please. So pausing just a moment to reflect on evidence of a changing electric industry. I think Mike did a great job again in terms of laying out the shift between sort of the old goals of the regulatory system and some of the new emergent goals of the regulatory system. But I think it bears sort of repeating and taking a closer look at some of the driving factors that are transforming the power sector system. Next slide, please. Just very quickly to just help underscore the snapshot. I mean, so, clearly there are some primary drivers that are animating this energy transition. A lot of folks like to use the 3 Ds, which is the sort of decarbonized, decentralized, and distributed grid, or you could also think about it as clean, decentralized, and intelligent grid. Regardless, what's underway is this sort of transition and evolution from a traditional power grid system that was centralized and had one-way power flows to now a distributed, cleaner, two-way power flow, dynamic power flow environment. And what that means essentially is that the ways in which we incent utility performance, the types of outcomes that we expect from the system are evolving as well. Next slide, please. Not only is the physical operation of the system evolving and changing, but customers' expectations of what they expect to get in terms of energy services is very much changing as well. And this change and these expectations are coming in part from a shift in consumer expectations across other industries, whether they be media services such as Netflix, lodging services such as Airbnb, or retail platforms like Amazon. And in the common thread across these is one of digital disruption, but with customer-centric thinking winning out in the end. There's this evolution of a platform business model that's emerging and disrupting industries across the board. Next slide, please. So in pivoting now to beginning to sort of survey and highlight some of the alternative regulatory mechanisms that have been in existence for some time, and then gathering those according to some discrete categories so we can sort of understand the tools in the toolkit better, and then how they may all fit together in a holistic manner under the rubric of a performance-based framework. Next slide. So I like to think about organizing alternative regulatory mechanisms, specifically those that apply to performance-based regulatory discussions, across 3 primary categories. You'll see those on the far left-hand column in this table. Revenue adjustment mechanisms, performance mechanisms, and other regulatory mechanisms, sort of a catch-all for some that don't neatly apply to these first 2 buckets. So what do we mean by revenue adjustment mechanisms? Well, these are alternative regulatory mechanisms that focus on target revenues, how they're determined, how they're collected and adjusted over time. And they help shift and evolve the regulatory structure to incentivize cost control and focus more on performance. Mechanisms that fall under this bucket include revenue decoupling mechanisms, multi-year rate plans, formula rates, as well as earnings sharing mechanisms. And then looking at the second category, performance mechanisms, these are mechanisms that provide more specific incentives to reach performance targets that are aligned with policy, regulatory, and customer priorities. And as we'll show in a later slide, performance mechanisms can climb a hierarchy of sophistication from reported metrics, which are just a unit of measurement, to scorecards, which take a unit of measurement against a target or benchmark. And then finally, a performance incentive mechanism, which is a unit of measurement against the target where financial dollars are attached as well. The final category, other regulatory mechanisms, again, a catch-all that can help level the playing field in terms of the financial incentives for utilities to invest in traditional utility-owned solutions versus perhaps more cost-effective but third-party owned solutions. These types of mechanisms can include shared savings, as well as other modes of sort of this CapEx, OpEx equalization, which is allowing a utility to earn revenues off of a prepaid third-party contract. New York is some leading examples in that category, as well as Illinois for treatment of some cloud computing expenditures on the part of the utility. And finally, the regulatory sandbox example that I mentioned at the outset with Vermont falls under this bucket. Next slide. So just double clicking on revenue adjustment mechanisms, taking a little bit of a closer look at that. You know, there has been increasing attention to this particular category of mechanisms, and they've been increasingly adopted in the US, and they can help transition utility towards a more performance-based and customer value-centric regulatory model. I think, you know, decoupling has certainly been a mechanism that's been around for quite some time. You can see the figure on the right-hand side. This is merely illustrative, and you know, certainly the details, as Mike mentioned, of how these specific mechanisms are calibrated and the risk sharing between customers and utilities certainly informs, you know, where they would fall on this plotted graph here. But just as a general notion, sort of moving from sort of less sophisticated or less performance-based type mechanisms that impact revenue adjustments, such as cost trackers in the lower left-hand side, you know, climbing that curve towards multi-year rate plans in the top right-hand corner of that graph. Again, revenue adjustment mechanisms focus on how utilities' target revenues are first determined and collected and adjusted over time. Increasingly, what we're seeing throughout the country is an enhanced interest in multi-year rate plans. And that has been one of the primary, I think, and nice leading examples of revenue adjustment mechanism emergence in the recent past. Decoupling has been around for some time and pairs nicely with a number of other PBR mechanisms that we'll highlight later on in this presentation. But this also includes things like forward test years, which may increasingly become important as we're, you know, facing an uncertain future, and historic costs may no longer be as indicative of the types of you know, forward projections for costs for utilities going forward. Next slide. So here's a couple of maps just sort of highlighting where some of these revenue adjustment mechanisms are in place today across the US. You see revenue decoupling precedents are highlighted on the map on the left, as well as some multi-year rate plan precedents on the right-hand side. The next slide. Just want to talk a bit about performance mechanisms as well. You know, as you can see in the figure on the right, there is a hierarchy or different levels of performance mechanisms in this conceptual framework. And the performance mechanisms can be used to assess diverse areas of utilities performance, and these can include things, sort of traditional values and outcomes such as safety and reliability, customer satisfaction, but also more emergent outcomes that are being visited upon the electric system. These could be types of outcomes that are related or interrelated with the development and integration of distributed energy resources, or the achievement of discrete public policy goals such as electrification of transportation or decarbonization. You know, within the conceptual framework, there are sort of three levels to performance mechanisms. So the first being reported metrics. Reported metrics are simply a unit of measurement against which you can track towards a broader regulatory goal, be that reliability or customer satisfaction or decarbonization or other public policy targets. When you take that reported metric, that unit of measurement, and you add a target to it, be it a threshold value level or a benchmark compared to a peer, that transforms that reported metric into a scorecard, an increased level of sophistication as well as increased level of performance visualization for that specific metric. And then finally, when you take a reported metric, you establish a target for that metric, and then you add a financial incentive, either upside or downside, or both, as it may be. That becomes a performance incentive mechanism. and can be a powerful tool to help incent utility performance and behavior against a specific outcome. Next slide, please. With respect to the other regulatory mechanism category, that third category I've mentioned, I just wanted to spend a little bit more time highlighting this regulatory sandbox approach, as well as the leading example of Vermont. So what do we mean when we use this term regulatory sandbox? You know, it's a concept that's been used across other industries, including the financial industry, where fintech companies have been, exploring new products and services that perhaps did not fit neatly into the old regulatory frameworks. So there are concepts developed to address regulatory uncertainty, and they give companies sort of space to innovate and some temporal relaxation of traditional regulations for a limited period. And this allows for products and services to be rolled out more quickly to customers and a chance for some iterative feedback and prototyping on a condensed time scale. So how this has been manifest most discreetly, I think, in the electric power sector in the U.S. has been through that Vermont example. There, the commission has laid out a sort of 18-month sandbox time window for Green Mountain Power to be able to, upon 15 days notice, move forward with an innovative pilot so long as it meets certain criteria and does not last longer than 18 months. This vehicle has allowed Green Mountain Power to roll out some very innovative customer offerings, including the Powerwall program that they rolled out to help shave their peak demand on their system. That was, I think, received a lot of press at the time. Most recently, they've used this vehicle to introduce sort of energy as a service model, a sort of bundled subscription model for customers that allows them to pair rooftop solar with an electric vehicle as well as traditional electric service under sort of a bundled subscription style fee, which will be interesting to see the types of customer responses that come from that. One thing that we're highlighting is, as regulators and commissions begin to respond to the current COVID-19 crisis, there may be a desire to explore and examine, innovative rate designs that, specifically target and assist low-income populations. And this sort of regulatory sandbox approach or innovative pilot framework could be one vehicle to help quickly expedite implementation of specific time-limited rate design approaches as well. Next slide, please. So now we've laid out some of the pieces, some of the tools in the toolkit, just trying to quickly pull them all together so we have some time here to enter into Q&A and have a discussion as well. Next slide. So in order to create sufficient space for innovation, to be able to drive increased performance and enhance customer satisfaction, contain costs overall, as well as to help facilitate the transition to a model that allows the utility to integrate a diverse set of resources, not just traditional utility-owned resources, but third-party grid-scale resources alongside more increasing customer-sited resources. It's our view that policymakers should really begin to explore an advanced PBR framework that includes some critical core elements. And I've laid out some of those core elements here to the right, and these largely reflect the experience and the developments underway with Hawaii's PBR experience as well. From the revenue adjustment mechanism category, looking at the pursuit of a multi-year rate plan, which could have an extended period of 3 to 5 years. Didn't get into the details of the different structures that can be brought to bear and the different details that come into play when evaluating multi-year rate plans, but certainly happy to have a deeper dive discussion on that offline at a different time. It also includes revenue decoupling to sort of help facilitate and help eliminate barriers to adoption of energy efficiency measures, as well as customer-sited resources such as rooftop PV and distributed storage, as well as earnings sharing mechanisms that sort of help bound the risk as you move towards a more performance-based approach. What you're really hoping to do in part is to help shift more risk from customers back onto utilities. And so as you shift that risk on the utilities, there's, it's prudent to have some bounding around, where that performance may end up manifesting, both on the upside as well as the downside, to ensure, on the one hand, customer protection so that utilities are not over earning, but on the flip side, ensuring that financial integrity of the utility is maintained and upheld. And I think that's highlighted even more during this particular global pandemic crisis we're experiencing. And then finally, performance mechanisms are very much a critical part of an advanced PBR framework. And I think that includes a portfolio approach of some amount of reporting metrics to highlight performance and increase transparency, as well as a mix of scorecards and performance incentive mechanisms as appropriate to the specific outcome that's being targeted. And then finally, those final two categories, shared savings approaches can help, shift a utility's willingness to begin exploring, non-traditional utility-owned opportunities for grid solutions. And then the regulatory sandbox is a way to help foster and create space for additional innovation on the system. Okay, next slide, please. And again, so many more details to explore within each of these mechanisms, as well as how one might design a comprehensive framework alongside the different process elements that would go into beginning to get started, as Mike touched on a little bit earlier. So happy to have any and all of those conversations in more detail. My contact info is here. Looking forward to a bit of discussion now. Thanks.
Okay.